Hey, everybody, welcome again to another episode of the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. I'm joined today by Jennifer Gerlach. And Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, listen, I found out about you. You have a blog that you write for Psychology Today, which is it's an online directory. If anybody needs a therapist to find a therapist, they can go there and find one. But there are also blog posts that are posted there by members of the directory, and you're one of them. And your blog is entitled Beyond Mental Health. And I came across a blog post that you wrote that I thought, boy, that's kind of intriguing. And it was titled Autism, Adolescence, and the Creation of an Identity. And I thought, ooh, I want to talk to Jennifer about this. So what I thought I'd do is just kind of go through and ask you some questions about the not only about the blog post, but I think part of this also relates to you as well. And one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is when you start reading this article, and I'll post this, so if anybody wants to read it, they can. But you start off with this very personal anecdote about asking your parents if you were adopted by aliens. And what made you want to share that part of your story in this blog post, and how has it shaped your work with autistic clients?
Absolutely. So I think it's a really common experience for autistic people to feel
Yeah.
almost like we've landed on the wrong planet. Our minds work a little bit differently. And because of that, we're adjusting a little bit differently. And so growing up, I often felt like I don't quite fit in. I don't quite belong. I'm not quite
Yeah.
like the others. And at that age, it was actually kind of hard. It was really hard because I wanted to be
Mm,
like the others. I wanted to have friends. I wanted to
yep.
fit in. And so I think kind of this fantasy about what if I could be an alien? What if the mothership's going to come back for me someday?
Yeah.
That was something that gave me a little bit of hope, although I was pretty sure I wasn't an alien. But I did ask my parents, hey, was there any chance I was adopted by aliens? Or have
Yeah.
there been any incidents where an alien has impregnated a
Right.
human? Things to that nature.
Yeah.
The way I think that this has shaped my work with autistic clients has been a little bit more appreciation for those core identity and connection difficulties that can come with
Mm.
autism and come with, being a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of folks, a lot of autistic folks kind of sense that early on that there's something about me that's different. I'm
Yeah.
not, I don't do things the same way. Why is that? Why am I not doing things the same way that, Jack or Amanda are? Or, why do things seem to be either easier for them or just different for them? And I just kind of go about things in a different way. So I think a lot of that starts early on when you start doing some comparing and contrasting between yourself and other kids in school and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think even before we get any farther, I forgot to ask you what you do for a living, because I think this is a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
important part of the
Yeah,
Autism
yeah.
Nation
I'm
as they
I'm a
listen to this.
psychotherapist.
Yeah,
That's
go.
that's the bulk of my work. I also write. I wrote a workbook for individuals who experience psychosis called the Psychosis and Mental Health Recovery Workbook. And then I
Nice.
do training. So I train other therapists in working with individuals with psychosis and individuals who are autistic.
Okay. All right. So that's good for the Autism Nation to know that you're a therapist and you've done
Yes.
a lot of work with lots of different types of people. So thanks for clarifying that. Well, you describe the adolescent identity journal as squiggly. I like that word, squiggly,
Mhm.
especially for autistic youth. What are some of the biggest differences you've observed between how autistic teens and neurotypical teens form their identities? And the reason that I asked, or I kind of put that in the context of teenagers, is because this is the point in life where a lot of people start to really think about who am I as a person,
Yeah.
and who do I want to be moving forward? And there are all these
Yeah.
questions, and you're just trying to do a lot of experimenting and answering questions and figuring things out. But for you, What do you think some of those differences are between how autistic teens and neurotypical teens form their identities?
Absolutely. So traditionally, we get to know ourselves through other people, through our
Mm,
relationships, peer
yes,
relationships, sometimes those early romantic, take somebody to the dance, go to prom, dating relationships, finding our interests, experimenting with different hairstyles, things like that.
sure.
And for an autistic person, often social interaction can be tricky.
Mm,
And so when there's not that peer group to develop that sense of self, it can be a little bit more squiggly even than
hmm
for a neurotypical person. I think for many of us, it's a little bit more elongated. I know that, I certainly was developing my sense of self far into my 20s, versus some of
Sure.
my friends, they had a little bit more figured out by 18 or 17.
hmm
Um, Not that any of us ever has everything figured out, but
hmm
learning about social pieces and then, into my 20s actually finding my tribes and finding people I could relate to. And I think that helped a lot. I think the other piece is for a lot of autistic folks, we have very deep interests that may or may not be shared with our peers. So,
Okay.
some of my interests growing up were IQ tests,
Hmm.
hypnosis, and
Oh,
dogs, animal behavior. So you can kind
okay.
of see where I came into
Yeah,
therapy as an interest in psychology. But,
sure.
um, those aren't common interests for a
No.
teenager or a child. So sometimes we get a little bit more of our sense of self through these interests that we really deeply get engaged with, because that can be a lot of our time and that can be where we feel most competent.
Hmm. Yeah, I never thought about how identity could be formed or formed partially around interest, around special interest.
Yeah.
But that sort of helps answer the question, who am I or what's important to me? I guess that kind of
Mhm.
figures into all that as well. So that's good information. Well, I know that in that article that you wrote that the concept of masking comes up a lot. And in your clinical experience, Jennifer, how does long-term masking impact identity formation and mental health?
Absolutely. Oh, it does a lot. It's
Yeah.
common, I think, especially with females,
Okay.
where, maybe somebody has taken a lot of time to blend in at the compromise of their true self. And so that turns into a lot of mimicking of what they perceive as the socially accepted behaviors,
Mm.
but maybe not fully feeling connected. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in a sense, that can kind of handicap that growth because you're hiding your true selves. Your relationships can feel less authentic. And then it gets to a point of where am I? I think that this leads to a lot of very low self-worth, especially in women who are autistic in their early 20s, a lot of susceptibility, the research and the statistics around intimate partner violence and people who are autistic, unfortunately, women who are
Mm.
autistic are at very high risk of that. I think
Wow.
that's part of it because of the, low self-worth and being willing to kind of blend in, and then it could just be taxing, if you feel
Mm-hmm.
more comfortable with your shoes off, if you feel more comfortable moving around, if you feel more
Yeah.
comfortable not making eye contact, if you're more comfortable with not having all these extra sounds, and all of those things are kind of at you all at once all the time,
Yeah.
and you're not getting any accommodation, that's going to really run down your battery.
Yeah. And maybe lead to burnout at some point in
Yeah,
time.
absolutely.
Well, you brought up an interesting point about women who are autistic, and what I'm hearing you say is that maybe women, more so than guys, will try to hide features, the features of themselves, who they truly are. Why do you think that's more characteristic of women than it would
Yeah,
be for
yeah. So they used to
guys?
call it, yeah, the female camouflage.
Okay.
And I think it's just because of how our society is socialized. Women are
Mm-hmm.
encouraged in general to blend in more, not to
Yeah.
stand out.
Mm-hmm.
And so for an autistic woman, that can be really tricky because it's like when you don't feel like quite like the others and you're having difficulty following those things, and that increased pressure to not have these, extreme interests, to not be somebody who stands out too much, that can lead to masking and imitating, almost like somebody trying to dance and they're watching other people dance. They're trying to figure out how to do a
Yeah.
dance that's not theirs, you know?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I guess that would be really important for like us, for therapists to
Hmm.
know that, this is something for a woman who's coming in to see you that they might not necessarily show who they truly are, their autistic characteristics, and that this is something that we have to be knowledgeable about,
Yeah,
especially, when we work with neurodivergent folks, that, this could be a possibility, and to make it okay for people to be
yeah.
who they truly are. So, yeah, that's a good point. Well, are there signs that parents or therapists can watch for that, someone, especially autistic folks, might be losing touch with their real self?
Yeah, I think that if they start embracing interests that aren't their interests, so say
Mm-hmm.
somebody they have no interest in sports, but their friends have interest in sports, and they're talking to their friends and they're like, "Oh yeah, I love sports," that
Right.
kind of flag. Not that teens don't do that anyway, but if
Yeah.
there's a lot of that,
Mm-hmm.
if they are hiding interests they have, so say that they have a lot of interest in the stars, but they don't talk to their friends about the stars because they don't think that's going to be embraced. That's kind of
Sure.
a sort of masking.
Yeah.
And then, especially if you see a lot of loneliness, if they have people they're around, but they still seem very lonely,
Mm-hmm.
disconnected, the conversations aren't going that deep. If there's a circle of friends, but it's changing, because sometimes
Mm-hmm.
somebody can kind of get away with moving from one friend group to another friend group to another friend group, but not feel really connected with those friends. Those are
Mm-hmm.
signs that there might be some difficulties with that developing sense of self.
Yeah, and it's almost like I have to be careful what I share with other people because they might not perceive me positively if I really
Sure.
show them who I am, but by virtue of doing that, they're kind of denying their own true identity. So
Yeah.
it's a real conflict, from what
Yeah.
I'm hearing you say there. So, hey everyone, Chris Corto here. You may have heard me talk before about something I'm putting together that I can't wait to share with you. It's an online course for newly diagnosed autistic folks. Newly diagnosed meaning in the last year or two. Here's what's included: masking, emotional exhaustion, and autistic burnout, how to tell people that you're autistic, and how to navigate those relationships moving forward, and putting together the pieces of your autistic identity. Sound like that's something you're interested in? I'm guessing yes. And by the way, you don't have to be newly diagnosed to take the course. Any autistic person will benefit from what's in there, which is very practical and designed to make significant and lasting changes in your life. Send me an email if you'd like to be put on the waiting list, and I'll let you know when it's ready, which will likely be in fall 2025. My email address is chris@chrisquarto.com. And now back to the episode. So, well, you highlight that autistic people often feel more self-esteem when they identify with autism. And what do you think needs to happen culturally or within families to help that kind of healthy identity development take root earlier?
Yeah, I think just education around autism in a way that's neurodiversity affirming. So
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that people can have all kind of differences in how they experience the world and that it's not anything to do with being less than, it's not anything to do with having less empathy or less ability. It's more about a different way of processing. And that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge the difficulties that come with it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the meltdowns, the obsessions, for many autistic people, there is a language delay. And those are real difficulties that we
Mm-hmm.
certainly don't want to minimize and just say, oh, everything's great. It's a superpower. Just ignore it. That's not right either. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we can embrace autism as a different way of experiencing the world and try to understand it, kind of like you would try to understand somebody from a different culture,
Right.
that a lot good can come from that.
Yeah, it's not less than, it's
Hmm.
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like what you said about education, about educating people about that. And when I was just thinking as you were talking about that, I don't know if you had this experience when you were in elementary school, but oftentimes the school counselor especially in elementary schools will come into classrooms to do guidance lessons, and they'll teach about different types of topics. And wouldn't it be a great thing for them to teach the kids about neurodivergence and
Absolutely.
about these differences, and that it's not less than, that it's just a different way of thinking about things or processing information, and that kind
Absolutely.
of stuff. I think it really should start early on. All of this kind of education should start early on. And
Yeah,
hopefully that would change
absolutely.
some attitudes.
Absolutely. And including autistic people or otherwise neurodivergent people in that process. Maybe bringing
Exactly.
in a neurodivergent speaker or,
Yeah.
if a student is neurodivergent and they are willing to share some of their experiences, that could be
Hmm.
helpful because
Yeah.
it's not a purely clinical thing. It's kind of almost
No.
cultural in ways.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, I really liked your point about encouraging autistic adolescents to explore their special interest in group settings. Can you give an example of a time when you saw this strategy make a real difference for a teenager?
Yeah. So I'm going to be very vague
Okay.
for confidentiality, but
Sure.
um, you know, somebody I worked with had a very strong interest in history and was having a lot of difficulties. That person got involved with their school's Scholar Bowl. They knew all of these random facts about history, and getting involved in the school Scholar Bowl turned into be a really good thing for them. By
Wow.
a couple of months, they had a few friends and they started feeling more confident about themselves. And so it went from being something where they were constantly giving these random facts to they're the star of the Scholar Bowl team.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
and I could see how that could really be done in a lot of different ways. I could think of a person who has a special interest in music, joining the school band or just lots of different ways of expressing themselves and really getting into those special interests. And I think all that is part of, again, identity development as well, as
Yeah.
we've been talking about. So. Well, your article touches on the idea that autism is not just a diagnosis, it's an identity, which is a
Mhm.
fantastic point. What's your take on why some autistic people embrace that label while others avoid it, even to the point of, declining any kind of support?
Sure. So we'll start with the avoidance piece. I think that we unfortunately have a long, dark history of mischaracterizing autistic people. So I know even myself, when I began undergraduate studies, I was taught that autistic people lacked theory of mind, that they had less empathy. And
Right.
those were kind of things my parents were told about me.
Yeah.
I do have empathy, a lot of it, and I
Yeah.
do have a theory of mind.
Yep.
Uh, so some of the stereotypical view of autism is something that many people don't want to identify with. Nobody wants to think of themselves as less than of a person. And the reality is autistic people aren't less of a person, but sometimes they get treated that way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when a person is given the label, especially in schools, they can feel stereotyped, and sometimes they are. Sometimes they're put in like autism specific social skills groups, and those social skills groups teach neurotypical social norms, but they call them
Yeah.
social skills, and that can be a whole thing. Um, I think that in the neurodiversity affirming communities, there's been a more positive spin and more of an idea that this is just a different way of experiencing the world and that it's possible to have
Mm-hmm.
experienced the world this way since you opened your eyes the first time and that can be okay, that can be part of who you are because it does affect every aspect of integrating information and experiencing the world
Mm-hmm.
and that's not a bad thing. That's not something we
Right.
necessarily have to chase away. But again, difficulties can come, and that doesn't mean that we don't need to accommodate some of those. So somebody might, for example, get certain interventions to help them with speech, or someone else might
Mm-hmm.
need certain accommodations for sensory needs. That's all good and well, but just this idea that it could be part of who you are and that can
Yeah.
be okay. And that it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it could be something you can embrace and meet other people who think and feel the same way.
Yeah. I totally and I totally agree with what you said at the very beginning of that
Mhm.
when you were talking about how the old thought was that autistic people don't have empathy
Mhm.
or they don't have theory of mind, meaning that they can't see the perspectives of other people.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily true. And it's almost like one of the things about autism is there's this saying that you've probably heard the sayings that once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic
Yeah.
person, meaning that
Yeah.
everybody's different. And I guess the thing that I don't like is when people make sweeping generalizations
Mhm.
about autistic people, like they don't have empathy or they can't see the perspectives of other people. And you just kind of debunk that with your own lived experience well, that's not me. I can do those things fine. So there are a lot of differences among people who are autistic, and not one person is the same as another person. We're all, even within the autism community, autistic people are quite unique. So, and I think that that's a very important thing for people to understand. I think it's a really important thing for neurotypical people to understand. Any words of wisdom that you'd like to pass along to the Autism Nation today? Anything about autism in general, about identity, anything that you would like to impart before we close today?
Yeah. Just that it's okay to not completely know who you are. And it's okay to explore. It's okay to embrace the
Hmm.
person behind your eyes. And it's okay if you don't know your preferences.
Hmm.
It's okay to experiment and it's okay to learn from others, but it's also okay to disagree and to be different from others in ways. And my hope is that if we can embrace this, we can all lead to be a more compassionate society, not just for autistic people, but for everyone.
Yeah.
That there could be a million ways of seeing the world, different cultures, different
Yeah.
neurodivergencies, different all kind of things, and that's all great.
Those are great points. What I really like what you just said there was um, just to take the time to figure out who you are and the identity development. I think that when you look at theories of identity development, I'm thinking back to my undergraduate studies when I learned
Mhm.
about Eric Erikson and how he said, yeah, usually by the age of 20, people figure out who they are. Well, that's not necessarily the case, and it doesn't have to be just at that
Yeah.
arbitrary, age 20 that people take years to figure out who they are. And you're right, it is okay. There is
Yeah.
no defined timeline for that. And that for some people it takes them a little longer, and that's okay. I
Yeah.
mean, for some people it's a lifelong process figuring out who I am, what's important to me, what do I want to do with my life, all those types of big questions. And so I like that you're kind of giving permission and freedom for people to do that kind of exploring. Well, Jennifer, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, ask you questions about either the article or anything else autism wise, how could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, website's easiest. There's a contact form on there, and there's also an email address on there. But the website would be www.truestorycounseling.com. And always glad
TrueStoryCounselor.com.
to chat, always glad to connect with others. I really appreciate meeting new people.
Okay, and I will put that in the show notes so people can get a hold
Awesome.
of you if they'd like to. And thanks for spending time with me
Yeah,
today. This was a
thank
really
you.
enjoyable conversation, and I learned a lot, and I hope Autism Nation learned a lot as well. So thanks again for joining me, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Okay, have a good rest of the day.
You too.